Hi guys, this is your girl Wakeji Kamore and welcome to Reflections by Wakeji Kamore. Today we are going to be looking at Ezra chapter 7. By the way, let me tell you guys, we are only 4 chapters to finishing this book. This is such a short book. It only has 10 chapters and we're in chapter 7 and then chapter 8, chapter 9 and then to Maliza at chapter 10. If you haven't read this chapter, by the way, book pause and read it. It has only 28 verses. You can do this. Atujafika zile vitabu ziko na 156 verses in one chapter and you're like, what? So they should have just made this like 3 chapters. You know? But this only has 28 verses. Please listen to it, or rather read it for yourself, and then you can come back and listen to the summary and the takeouts that I have for this chapter. So in verse 6, in chapter 6 rather, what has happened that Darius has written a decree to Governor Tatanai has given the resources that are needed to construct the temple, the resources needed for the burnt offerings. The temple has been completed, has been dedicated, and people have had like a whole feast in the temple, which is really, really good. In chapter 7, we're going to be introduced to a man. Finally, we are meeting this Ezra. Unajua tumesoma Ezra karibu iishe na tujaona hata Ezra pahali. Finally, now we are going to meet Ezra. Ezra is introduced in this chapter. And in verse 1, it talks about the origin of Ezra, or rather the descendants of Ezra. It says Ezra, son of me. I'm not going to read those names, honestly. Me nasoma to Ezra, son of, at the end it says, the son of Elzar, son of Aaron, chief priest. So, Ezra had come from the family of Aaron. You guys remember Aaron? He was the first high priest of Israel. Izo siku za wilderness. Many days, probably like 800 years or definitely more than 500 years ago. And that's just, there's a whole lineage of Ezra, son of, until we see the final one person we actually knew, who is Aaron, the chief priest. So, one thing you need to know is that Ezra had come from the tribe of the Levites, and he'd come from the family of Aaron, the chief priest or the high priest of that time. He was a teacher and he was well versed in the law of Moses. He was a teacher that completely knew the law of Moses. Like, he'd taken time to read it, he'd taken time to just, just make it known to himself. And then it says that in this time that we're reading about, the king granted him everything that he asked for, and because the hand of God was on Ezra. One of the things that happens is that we see the second returns, or the second returnees from the exile. There are many returns. I think there are like 3 returns from exile, and this is the second one. And the person who led this team was Ezra. It talks about how that the king granted some of the Israelites, including priests and Levites and musicians, gatekeepers, temple servants, to actually return to Jerusalem and to go and rebuild the temple. Rather, to just go back to Jerusalem, not to rebuild. The temple has already been rebuilt, so they're just going to go back. And it talks about how Ezra arrived in Jerusalem in the 5th month of the 7th year, and he had begun this journey on the 1st day of the 1st month. So it shows us that this journey from Babylon to Jerusalem took him a whole 4 months. Imagine 4 months. So is it 4 months you're walking? Hey, gosh, I'm already tired. I'm already tired. And it says, my favorite verse in this whole chapter is actually verse 10. Let me just read from verse 10. It says, he had begun his journey from Babylon on the 1st day of the 1st month, and he arrived in Jerusalem on the 1st day of the 5th month. Actually, it took like 5 months. For the gracious hand of his God was on him. For Ezra had devoted himself to doing 3 things: to study, to observe the law, and to teach its decrees and laws in Israel. So one of the things that we realize in verse 9 is that the gracious hand of God was on Ezra because he had devoted himself to study, observe, and then teach the decrees, the laws to Israel. And then it shows here that King Artaxerxes wrote a letter. Actually, wow, this is actually interesting. Let's pause there. I actually would have thought that Ezra was existing in the time of King Darius, but it looks like it was King Artaxerxes. That means by the time Ezra is coming back to Jerusalem, it seems like King Darius has not given the decree to continue building the temple, which is interesting. That King Artaxerxes is the one that is actually giving a favor to Ezra to go back to Jerusalem, even if he had given a decree to stop building the temple. Isn't that interesting? I find that very, very interesting, and requires a little bit of research there. I just need to figure out like what was the order of the kings, and because I don't understand whether Ezra was came after King Darius or came before King Darius, because that would mean that he came back to Jerusalem when the construction had halted. Anyway, a little bit research needed there. So anyway, one of the things that happened in this chapter is that King Artaxerxes decrees that all the treasuries of the Euphrates are to provide with diligence whatever Ezra the priest, the teacher, and teacher of the law of God of heaven may ask of you, up to 100 talents of silver, 100 hulls of wheat, 100 baths of wine, and 100 baths of olive oil, and salt without limit. And I just like the fact that this king is actually giving Ezra like a letter to say, these are the things I have, because he gave him even gold and silver, and he gave him articles to put in the temple of God. And then he is, amemzidikisha na barua to say that, just to remind them that this treasury of Euphrates were to provide with Ezra everything that he needed once he gets back to Jerusalem, which was pretty good. Another thing that happens in this chapter is that Ezra is given like a job description. It was like, when you get there, in accordance to the wisdom of God which you possess, appoint magistrates and judges to administer justice to all the people of the Trans-Euphrates, all who know the law of God, and you are to teach any who do not know the laws of God. And whoever does not obey the law of God and the law of the king must surely be punished by death, banishment, confiscation of property, or imprisonment. And then here we see in verse 27 that Ezra is praising the Lord, and this is the part in the book of Ezra that where Ezra is now written in the first person. It looks like Ezra is now writing the book from this point onwards, because this is the point where Ezra is introduced in the book of Ezra, and from this point he starts to actually, you can tell he starts to write the book, because he starts to say, I took courage and gathered leaders from Israel to go up with me. So what do we learn from this chapter? Is that the grace of God is upon those who study the law, obey the law, and teach the law. And when we talk about teaching the law of God, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're teaching the law of God at a pulpit or even at a podcast, like on a podcast like this. Even just simply teaching the law of God to your children, teaching the law of God, teaching the word of God to the people that surround you, teaching the word of God in a fellowship, teaching the word of God at your workplace. The Lord is gracious to those that study the word of God, to those that obey the word of God, and to those that teach the word of God. I like the fact that it has been listed in that way. It doesn't say study the word of God and then teach the word of God. It says study, obey, then teach the word of God. Hapo kwa obey ndio tunakosa sana, hapo ndio tuko minus, but that's the order, that we are to study the word of God, we are to obey it, and then we are to teach it. And so that means that we are not supposed to be teaching something that we are not obeying. Oh my goodness. Hey, imagine that. But I thank God because he's gracious, and I thank God that there's grace. There's a lot of grace for even those people that actually do teach the word of God, and those people include you. As you are listening to this podcast, and as you're getting the word of God, as you're studying the word of God, as you're obeying the word of God, pursuing to obey the word of God, sometimes you want so much to obey the word of God, but because we are fallen creatures. Sometimes we do fall, but there's grace for that. But we are to seek and to be pursuant about obeying the word of God. And we will see Ezra doing that even in the next chapter, where he really pursues to obey the word of God. And then we are to teach the word of God, and you have to teach the word of God in your natural space. It doesn't have to be at a pulpit, it doesn't have to be a podcast, it doesn't have to be, like in this big way that we imagine teaching the word of God looks like. Teaching the word of God can be as simple as teaching those people in your house, the people that you work with, the people in your family, the people that surround you, the people that you lead. That is what teaching the word of God looks like. And my prayer for you is that as you study the word of God, that the Lord will enable you to be pursuant of obeying the word of God, and that the Lord will give you opportunities to teach the word of God. And then we will experience the grace of God, because we've seen that the Lord was really gracious to Ezra, because he used to do these three things: study the word of God, obey the word of God, and teach the word of God. Thank you for listening, and see you tomorrow.